It might be fair to assume that having been invited to speak on hospitality and the arts, that somebody coming from a church community named for St. Benedict, who really cultivated a whole spirituality of hospitality, and somebody who comes from an arts-rich and arts-focused kind of a community would then want to talk about nothing but St. Benedict's table. I'm going to go sideways completely on this. I want to actually speak to you about some of the lessons that I have learned through my consideration of jazz. The theologian Jeremy Begbie, who's really done these extensive explorations on the connections between theology and music, talks about how music can enact theological wisdom in a way that words alone can't. And so I want to kind of use that as my starting point and speak a little bit about the culture of music and specifically the culture of jazz. This book was a passion for continues to be a passion over the last 5 years. And I have a hard time not going there when I have the opportunity. In an essay titled, "You Have to Be Invited," the musicologist Leonard Brown offered a picture of how musicians have traditionally been formed in African American culture. Brown's working thesis is that in this context, musicians have to be invited, have to be drawn in, mentored, and shaped by others in the community. There were no jazz studies programs at this time, Brown writes. The musicians were the keepers of musical knowledge and controlled its dissemination. Now, that description of the musicians as the ones who were keepers of the musical knowledge and who controlled the dissemination might not sound much like hospitality to most of you. Does it sound more like a case of the insiders getting to control which of the outsiders might be let in? Let me give you a picture of how it can actually work, has worked and continues to work in the world of jazz music. In the late 1940s, when he was still in his teens, the saxophonist Jackie McLean was befriended by the great bebop pianist Bud Powell in Harlem. The young Jackie McLean spent countless hours in Powell's home, talking with him, listening to him practice, even getting to play with him. It wasn't long before Bud Powell invited this young Jackie McLean to sit in with the band at one of the gigs at New York's legendary Birdland Jazz Club. Powell also introduced the young sax player to Miles Davis. And at the age of 19, Jackie McLean actually appeared on one of Miles Davis's albums, Dig. I think that my concept and my development accelerated fast, McLean later reflected, because I was in Bud's company and I heard him play so much and the music was going right into my mental computer, into my brain, and I think that helped me to develop very fast. Now move ahead from the late 40s, early 50s into the early 1990s, when a young sax player named Jimmy Green was studying under Jackie McLean at the University of Hartford. Once I met Jackie, Green commented to me, it was full steam ahead. Every time I talk about the saxophone or talk about jazz music or play jazz, I always think of Jackie. Recognizing some real talent in this young Jimmy Green, Jackie McLean took him under his wing. And it wasn't long before he was taking him into New York City to sit in with the band at his shows at the Village Vanguard. Now, move ahead again to January 2012, to a Jimmy Green concert at Winnipeg's Park Theatre, in which this now very well-established musician and educator was showcasing some of his new material. Midway through that show, Jimmy Green invited two of his own students from the University of Manitoba Jazz Studies program, where he was teaching at the time. Invited these two young students to join him up on stage with his crack band. And though those two students were not nearly of the caliber of their teacher, he made room for them on stage. He invited them in, giving to each extended solo time. We in the audience approved. Of course they weren't of his caliber. Jimmy Green had not been up to the caliber of Jackie McLean when he was invited to the Village Vanguard. Jackie McLean was not up to Bud Powell's level when he was invited to debut at Birdland. That's what it means to be invited. Now, for me, the question, if I pick up on Begbie's thought about how music and music culture might speak to the church, the question is, what might this have to say to us who care about the church, who care about the shape of ministry and community? After all, aren't we always supposed to be hospitable? I mean, isn't that one of the things we're supposed to do? Tom Bandy, a name probably familiar to some of you, who's worked hard in the area of congregational life and development. Tom Bandy even goes so far as to suggest that our churches have to learn to live as if they only had 3 walls. The back wall being so open and so fluid as to metaphorically not be there at all. Those who want to keep company with us or maybe just try us on for size to see what's going on in that place, in the midst of those people, must feel absolutely no resistance at all as they step through that metaphorical back wall into our midst. So real must be our hospitality, says Bandy. There has to be room for all. And I agree, and yet, to draw on St. Paul's image of the one body of Christ with its many members, the reality is that the members in any given congregation, any given community, are not so many interchangeable bits. Not everyone should necessarily preach. Not everyone should be entrusted with the formation of children. It's not everybody's gift. Not everyone should lead music. For that matter, not everyone should be baking pies for the community supper. I certainly shouldn't, unless you want to use a steak knife to cut through my crust. Yet, when the preacher, or the children's formation educator, or the musician, or the pie baker, or keeps his or her eyes open, what they begin to see is that there are, in fact, others in the community, maybe others who've just come through that fluid back wall, who might need to be invited. Who, because of their passion, their interest, their willingness to learn and to grow and to serve, could rightly be called out, mentored, and released into new life and service in that community and beyond. Far from being a sort of controlling gatekeeping, that model of being invited actually releases people to exercise and explore their own particular gifts and abilities. Gifts and abilities of which they might have only been very vaguely aware. I think, too, though, the story of Bud Powell taking Jackie McLean and Jackie McLean taking Jimmy Green and Jimmy Green taking those 2 young students from the University of Manitoba reminds us of something else. None of them stepped on stage fully formed. But stepping on the stage and playing in the company of those musicians was part of what formed them. And I think in our own communities, and maybe particularly through some of these exploration in the arts, to invite people in and to try on for size new expressions or new vocations or new ministry might actually be what helps them form into who and what they're called to be. That's part of what I've learned from paying attention to jazz. Thank you.